Thank you so much for being here. We're very excited to have you all here and to have our amazing panel with us to inaugurate our CHR lecture series that we are having this semester, next semester, and then next year. So this is the first year. We have it down already, so if anybody has any questions about what's the programming for the rest of the semester, just come see us and we'll let you know. But we wanted to welcome our panelists, our speakers. I also want to give thanks to my co-chair extraordinaire, Dr. Elizabeth Dillenberg, and our director extraordinaire, Sarah Butler, who, I couldn't do any of this. We couldn't do any of this without. We also want to thank a few of our sponsors, the Department of History, the Division of Arts and Humanities, the International Studies, Center for Folklore Studies, Center for Latin American Studies, the Humanities Institute, and Classics. So I think this is going to be an exciting event with a lot of food for thought. And so without further ado, I give the floor to my amazing colleague, Bert Harrill. Thank you. Oh, you have one. Perfect.
Yes, I'm Professor Bert Harrill in the History Department, and it is my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker this afternoon, Peter Hunt, who teaches at the University of Colorado-Boulder as Professor of Classics. A classical Greek historian, Dr. Hunt studies warfare and society, slavery, historiography, and oratory. He is the author of Slaves, Warfare, and Ideology in the Greek Historians from Cambridge University Press, 1998. This book challenges some of the most fundamental premises of Greek historiography, such as the primary sources omitting or glossing over the enlistment of enslaved people as soldiers. His second book, War, Peace, and Alliance in Demosthenes' Athens, also from Cambridge, 2010, examines Athenian thought and oratory on interstate relations comprehensively to understand how its democratic assemblies made decisions about war and peace. Additionally, Dr. Hunt has published an important textbook, Ancient Greek and Roman Slavery, from Wiley-Blackwell, 2018, a series of case studies that helpfully guide the reader through the methodology of studying ancient slavery comparatively, and which serves equally well as a reference work for historians of slavery in other periods. He has contributed chapters to the Oxford Handbook of Demosthenes, the Oxford Handbook of Thucydides, the Cambridge History of Greek and Roman Warfare, the Cambridge World History of Slavery, and the Cambridge History of the World. His talk today is entitled, How is the Water for Running Away? The Gender of Fugitive Slaves in the Classical World. Please join me in welcoming Professor Hunt. There is a handout.
Well, thank you very much, Bert, for that very generous introduction. And thank you very much, Sarah, Elizabeth, and Maria, for organizing this and for inviting me. I'm very honored and happy to be here. This project, this interest of mine, is still basically a 17,000-word messy whale of an article draft, which I cut down to be a 50-minute paper, which I gave this spring, and now it is reduced to under 30 minutes. So I'm saying this in that there are lots of things that I'm going to skip over, and you might notice on the handout, we've got a couple of things in brackets: family, work, and slavery. Those are things that I'm not going to be able to get to. But I'm definitely happy to talk about them in the questions and discussions. Okay. One drawback of being a classics professor of a certain age is that what you think is lively and topical ends up seeming as dated as the ancient history you are trying to spice up. Take This Is Water, a commencement speech by the writer David Foster Wallace, from which I take my title. I was aiming for a hook and wanted to seem a little hip, but in fact, he gave it in 2005. So I want to start with why I'm sticking with water in my title nonetheless. Mr. Wallace starts his speech by repeating a joke. Two young fish are hanging out, and a, parentheses, wise old fish swims past them and asks, "How's the water?" He moves on, and after a minute, they look at each other and ask, "What the hell is water?" Much of the speech explored the apparently natural and unquestionable water of life in the modern United States. David Foster Wallace committed suicide in 2008. It's not surprising he does not think much of the water of modern life. In this talk, I explore the chances enslaved men and women had to escape classical slavery by running away. My main argument will be that male slaves were much more likely to flee slavery than female slaves, and I think I can prove this. But it's equally important to figure out the reasons for this result. And to do so, we need to imagine the options, motivations, and tactics of radically different sets of enslaved people who lived thousands of years ago. We are faced with many challenges. Specifically, we need to wade into the water of slave experience. What proportion of slaves had children, and at what age? How attached were fathers to their children? Which slaves had which kind of shoes, since not all boots are made for walking? In a largely mapless world, did most slaves even know how to quickly navigate the mile around their house, or the 10 miles, or the 50 or 200 miles it would take to get to their destination, without street signs and without asking people for directions? And the topic that I'll highlight this afternoon is how fugitive slaves could find work and feed themselves in a harsh and poor world, and how this depended on whether they were men or women. This is all part of the water of ancient slave life and was crucial for slaves contemplating escape. I'm not sure whether ancient slaves would even talk about this water of their lives, which they would take for granted. Much less did their masters write about it, even when they represented or mentioned slaves or slaveries in a text that has come down to us. So when it comes to water, we need to search our ancient sources far and wide, and even after that, we'll often come up with no better than a plausible guess. So you'll notice in what follows that I jump around the ancient Greek and Roman world with hearty abandon, following the evidence rather than proceeding in a systematic manner. Of course, this is a terrible and in some ways an indefensible methodology. Archaic Athens was not imperial Rome, was not Egypt or late antique Gaul, but I take only occasional account of these chronological and geographical differences. I have a timid and a bold reason for this god-awful approach. The timid reason is that it's necessary. Slave life varied not only according to the date and place, but also according to the rural-urban setting, the size of slaveholding units, the type of work slaves did, whether the slaves were first generation or born in slavery, whether there was peace or war, and whether they were enslaved men or women. And I'm sure I'm forgetting other factors. Our evidence on the details of slave flight is not such that we can subdivide it to answer our question for each, or indeed for any of these subcategories of slavery. It's not even close. We need to accept whatever evidence we can find and make timid suggestions about what's most likely. Which leads to the bolder reason for my approach. I imagine that the large skew in male and female slave flight varied from place to place and time to time, but I bet it never came close to changing direction. Okay. My basic argument is that gender was one of the most important and consistent factors that influenced a slave's likelihood of seeking freedom through flight. Male slaves were much more likely than female slaves to run away from their master. I make my case in 3 steps. First, comparative evidence from several other slave societies, including the antebellum US South, reveals about 3/4 of fugitive slaves there were male. Now, overall differences between different slave systems are large, and the challenges of running away would seem a particularly obvious point. there are glaring contrasts between a dark-skinned slave, perhaps able to get to a free state or to Mexico from the south, and anything in the ancient world. So this comprehensive evidence, this comparative evidence suggested a question to me rather than providing an answer. The second step in my argument is that in the few cases where we're able to quantify the number of male and female runaways in a category of ancient evidence, we find far more men than women. So the third section of the paper examines the factors that contributed to the greater propensity of male slaves to flee their master compared with female slaves. And here we are often dealing with the water of the ancient labor market and of the daily life of enslaved and poor people. I have the most confidence in three of my conclusions. First, for many slaves, the long game, that is, their chance of staying free for the rest of their lives and of feeding, clothing, and housing themselves, was more important than the short game, the immediate opportunity to escape. Second, women faced more challenges in their long-term prospects than did men. Third, women were more constrained by children than men were. Okay, let me present some of the evidence. There are legal texts, references in almost every genre of literature, wanted posters on papyri, and historic references in historical works that suggest that many slaves ran away from their masters in the ancient Greek and Roman world. But beyond the vague many, it is impossible to quantify either the proportion of slaves who tried to run away or how many of those succeeded. Unfortunately, there is little prospect of going beyond wild guesses about the proportion of runaway slaves, but ancient historians have often pointed out ways in which the likelihood of slaves running away and of staying free varied according to the circumstances of slavery or depended on broader and social historical context, such as what were states at war, how large were the political units. So there has been little to no interest in the gender of fugitive slaves. In contrast, in the United States South, evidence on this issue has been known for a long time and is summarized in a few pages of Franklin and Schweninger's Runaway Slaves, Rebels on the Plantation. Their study, based on more than 2,000 newspaper wanted advertisements for fugitive slaves, showed that males made up about 80% of the fugitive slaves in all periods and states. And even historians who argue with this, critical historians, only want to argue this down to 2 out of 3. So the southern slave population had a natural gender ratio with approximately equal numbers of men and women, and so it's clear that male slaves were more likely than female slaves to run away. This same disparity holds in all New World slave societies, and right here I have to mean colonial slave societies, and in early modern Russia. I've poked around from other comparanda without success, but I'd be grateful for suggestions. Now, can we find any confirmation of this in ancient evidence? Surprisingly enough, we can. Some of this evidence is similar to the wanted advertisements used by Franklin and Schweninger. When a slave ran away, masters would have their description and rewards proclaimed by a crier in a public place. Such proclamations left no records, nor in most places did the written notices of runaway slaves that were sometimes posted. But in Egypt, announcements of runaway slaves and other documents referring to such fugitives do survive on papyri, preserved in the arid environment. Reinhold Scholl's Corpus de Ptolemaica Sklaventexte includes a convenient collection of papyri documents referring to runaway slaves in Ptolemaic Egypt. These refer to 22 male slaves and perhaps 6 to 8 female slaves. Thus, the proportion of this set of attested Egyptian runaways is a bit below 3/4 male, remarkably close to the southern evidence. The sex ratio among Egyptian slaves is not securely known, but the evidence we do possess from household census returns and records of sales, and all of this is on papyrus, points towards a slave population that was not merely even, but perhaps included more females. So it is significant that so large a proportion of runaway slaves are male. For Egypt in the Roman period too, papyri survived that refer to runaway slaves in various contexts. When I collected this evidence, I found 16 references to fugitive slaves of known or probable gender. 12 of these were male, 4 were female, which gives us, again, a ratio of 3/4 male. And again, we are dealing with a slave population that included as many females as males. So males, again, seem to have run away in disproportionate numbers. One last data set provides some confirmation. Slaves who had run away or were considered flight risks were traditionally tattooed or branded on their faces. It's pretty horrible. Starting in the 4th century CE, some slaveholders began to put hard-to-remove slave collars around the necks of some slaves, usually to discourage their slaves from running away and to make their return more likely if they did. A reasonable assumption is that slaves with such collars had tried to run away before, but had been recaptured. Okay? So while the wanted posters and other references to slaves on papyri show us a snapshot primarily of runaways at large, the slave collars arguably give us a snapshot of unsuccessful runaways. Or perhaps some of the collars had been ditched in successful escapes. Of the 37 such collars, some are of suspect authenticity. Most do not indicate the gender of the slaves. Only 9 are both authentic and give a definite indication of gender. 8 of these were once affixed to male slaves, who thus can constitute more or less 90% of this sample. Now, the gender ratio of slaves in general at this period is, as usual, not well known. Kyle Harper has highlighted one of our best roughly contemporary piece of evidence, a list of about 100 agricultural slaves from Thera, which does suggest a natural gender ratio. If this is typical, which is, we can't say for sure, or indeed at any overall gender ratio less than 90% male, male slaves are again disproportionately represented among runaways. So if we could take this argument as proven, the next step would naturally be to look for explanations for why men were more likely than women to resist slavery in this particular way. And I'm definitely not making any claim here about women's resistance to slavery outside of running away. But given the limited and possibly unrepresentative data, it would actually be somewhat disingenuous of me to imagine that my case is proven. So the more cogent these explanatory factors, the more inclined we should be to accept the direction of our admittedly imperfect evidence for the predominance of males among fugitive slaves. Am I causing this noise?
No, the elevator gets stuck.
Oh, okay. So this section aims both at explanation and at additional persuasion. But we are now dealing with water. Specifically, one key factor is the patriarchal structure of the ancient world and the gendered division of space and labor, which epitomizes Wallace's water. It shaped lives profoundly and often perniciously, but was rarely noticed, criticized, or even justified. But as the result of this water, almost every aspect of an enslaved person's feelings, decisions, plans, impulses, and outcomes when fleeing slavery would be profoundly influenced by whether they were male or female. A slave's decision to run away involved their whole and varied experience of slavery. It is that easy to imagine a long list of possible issues that were playing a part, and the gender of an enslaved person would affect all these issues. There are striking gender differences in the jobs slaves did, their families, and their economic prospects after flight. But as I noted in the time I have, I'll focus on this last topic, and especially the job market for escaped slaves in cities. So scholarship about fugitive slaves in the classical world focuses overwhelmingly on the way the slaveholding class tried to recapture escaped slaves and the punishments they might inflict on those they caught. This is, of course, what our ancient evidence tells us about. our evidence is focalized by the perspective of slaveholders. In contrast, how slaves who were not recaptured lived their lives was not in slaveholders' field of view, and thus is not much in our evidence. But that's the order I want to look at. And in doing this, we don't want to neglect the actions of slaveholders altogether. Their various tactics, as well as simple bad luck, posed a continuing risk for escaped slaves. Fugitive slaves were naturally nervous about recapture, as some ancient writers explicitly state. For example, the ex-slave and Stoic philosopher Epictetus. And this fear limited their options and cramped their lives. But how could fugitives support themselves? I want to make two arguments here. First, I want to emphasize the long-term economic risks of turning to flight. In fact, economic risks is a bit too abstract. I'm talking about avoiding destitution, starvation, and exposure to the elements. I think these risks go a long way to explain the many cases, and like enslaved people working as long-distance messengers, where slaves had an obvious opportunity to make a break for it and many did not. And I think the possibility of manumission is also a big part of that. Second, I want to show that these difficulties were more pronounced for women slaves due to the contours of the labor market in the ancient world, deriving in large part from the gender division of labor. Now, some ancient sources stress that the archetypical runaway slave lived not only an anxious life, but an impoverished one. For example, letter and papyri pleads for help, and this is totally unrelated to slavery, but they just say, please send us help so we don't die penniless like runaway slaves. This stereotype of life as a fugitive slave does not seem to have an ulterior motive in this letter, which is not about slavery. Nevertheless, the risk of starvation would be a disincentive to flee slavery and thus likely to be exaggerated by slaveholders, especially if they knew slaves could be listening, and that would be a lot of the time. Emphasizing this difficulty also played into one theme in slaveholder ideology, the rather upside down but common notion that masters provided for their slaves. For example, the Roman senator Seneca, that poor guy, stresses how much trouble and expense is involved in maintaining slaves. To this way of thinking, fugitive slaves were mad to forgo the nourishing care of their owners and risk starvation. So these statements by slaveholders are thus suspect, but even without them, most social historians would agree that the ancient world was for most free people a poor and harsh one. Slaves suffered all kinds of abuse, but slaveholders were relatively affluent, and their self-interest was tied up in their slaves not starving. And that is always, you've got to add, insofar as they were rational people, the slaveholders, rather than drunk, stupid, and vicious, which is always a possibility we need to keep in mind. So once slaves ran away, they were taking a big risk. And the long path, the long game for escaped slaves usually involved one of four paths. Let me just check how I'm going in time. Okay, I think I need to skip one of the four paths. But first of all, they could head for the wilderness, as Androcles, who you may know of lion paw fame, apparently did. And second, bandit gangs seem to have comprised many fugitive slaves. Bandits are in several cases representing as recruiting men from the slave population. And banditry must be considered a second option for fugitives, but I suspect mainly for the boldest, strongest, and most violent enslaved men. Though, of course, banditry, what's seen as banditry by the state and the slaveholders can fade into what we might consider a maroon. Third, Roman imperial texts suggest that some escaped slaves would find jobs in another large household or farm. And I think that's the one that I'm going to gloss over. And I want to focus on the fourth plan, which I think is the most common in my view, and that would be escape to a city or town far enough away to reduce the chances of being spotted and recaptured. A few cities, like Rome or Alexandria, might even be large enough so that a fugitive could just go to a different part of town and take their chances there. And here, I'm happy to rely on the arguments of Claire Holleran, who considers the economic prospects of free immigrants to Rome. The picture she paints is a harsh one. Central to Holleran's reconstruction is the intense competition for work, which kept wages low. And I'll quote, "Even those born and raised in the city, Rome, must have struggled to find steady employment. That people moved to Rome and survived is certain, but just as in our comparative cities, people lived on the very margins of subsistence." That was the situation for free immigrants. Prospects for fugitive slaves were even grimmer. The best they could manage was to equal the prospects of Holleran's free immigrants, who did not suffer the disabilities presented by the possibility of being recognized or captured. All fugitive slaves, like freeborn immigrants, were cut off from the many permanent jobs in domestic service, for example, because wealthy Romans preferred to be served by slaves and ex-slaves. And ex-slaves, with loans and support from their former owners, seem to have dominated the most profitable small businesses in the city. Whereas free immigrants came in search of economic improvement or to escape poverty, fugitive slaves were forced to distance themselves from their masters. This meant they had to avoid the very areas where they might possess the advantages of helpful contacts or local knowledge. Now, as you will surely have noticed, I'm not averse to speculation, but it's hard to reconstruct what the best practices would be for a nervous runaway in a new city trying not to attract unwanted attention and trying to avoid recapture. You would not want, like Cicero's escaped slave Dionysius, to have the bad luck to be spotted and accosted by friends of your former owner. I imagine there were places frequented by elite visitors, and hence dangerous, and other places where you'd be safer. And there would also be inconspicuous jobs and other ones where you might become well known, most dangerously among those of the same social class as your former owners. Finally, we know about the profession of slave catcher, largely from legal sources about collusive scams. But the existence of non-collusive bona fide slave catchers could greatly complicate fugitives' calculations. For example, smart slave catchers would know and frequent the most obvious places for a newcomer to find work. And they might be lurking with a long list of runaways and their descriptions and names at some place where you could find casual work. Now, things were even worse for escaped women slaves. Even while getting to a new place, women were less common out in public, and they would attract more attention while traveling. And this is noted even by southern fugitives. And Holleran notes that a preference for domestic slavery restricted the opportunities available to women in particular. For free immigrants or escaped slaves, casual labor was the best hope for work. The two biggest markets for casual labor in Rome were transportation, especially of food and other goods into Rome, and construction, which in many cities would vary a lot depending on the economy or the ambitions of the state or monarch at the time. But as far as our evidence goes, these were not the sorts of jobs that were ever done by women. Holleran points out that instead, quote, women could have turned to street trading and hawking. Other women may have provided services or entertainment, working as prostitutes, barbers, fortune tellers, and so on, while still others collected items for reuse or recycling. And I could also mention wet nursing. There's an interesting possibility there. On the harsh ladder of urban work, escaped women slaves would mostly be confined to the lowest and most precarious rungs. Enslaved women would know this and be less likely than men to light out for Alexandria, for example. So, in sum, though there are many aspects of the gendering of escape from slavery we wish we knew more about, the pull of children in slavery, which I've not been able to explore today, and the fear of poverty or destitution after flight sufficiently explain the tendency for enslaved women to run away less often than enslaved men. almost finished. Many aspects of women's and men's life in the classical world were deeply different in systematic ways. It would be surprising if this didn't affect the ability of enslaved men and women to escape slavery. These are aspects of the water of ancient life and poorly attested as a result. But there are at least two advantages of exploring ancient water. If you wait around enough, you sometimes find something new. Here I've focused on this propensity of enslaved men and women to run away, and on one of the two main factors that made enslaved women less likely to do this, their grim economic prospects in flight. On many other issues, I have had to rest content with increasing the total of Socratic knowledge in the world, but it is important for historians to know how much they don't know. The second advantage of this approach is that your wading around in the water is not determined by ancient texts and their elite male writers. No ancient source says a thing about the propensity of enslaved men or women to flee slavery. It is only arguably implied by the infamous gravestone of the slave trader Aulus Caprarius Timotheus. At the bottom of this gravestone, there's a depiction of a coffle of slaves. All the men are chained together at the neck. At the back are two women, probably enslaved women, unchained along with their children. Thank you very much. Oh, that's okay. So I was very worried about the time.
So we have a couple of minutes for questions. And if you have a question, we have a runner with a mic. Is that you? Or?
I just took her mic.
Oh, okay. Yes.
Thank you, Peter. I'm Tina Sessa. I'm going to have dinner with you
Oh.
later. So we can certainly. Oh. Hi, Peter. My name is Tina Sessa. I teach in the history department. I work in late antiquity. And I have a question. For the most part, I found much of what you said to be persuasive, but your ancient evidence, I can't help but wonder whether what your ancient evidence tells you isn't so much about fugitive slaves, but fugitive slaves whose owners bothered to look for them. And those are two different things. Now, obviously, male slaves are more valuable than female slaves. They literally cost more money. And so there may be a reason why you are more interested in looking for the male than the female. But of course, we don't, as you've pointed out numerous times in the talk correctly, what we don't know anything like in quantitative terms, what we're looking at. And when we have something like, for example, the slave collars, a sample size of 9 for 1,000 years, that's, there's only so much we can do with that, right? So I'm just wondering if you've thought about that. I mean, is what you're looking at not so much the number of people who have run away, so much as the people who have run away whose owners have taken the time and expense to look for them?
I definitely have thought about that because that's one of the big issues in the U.S. South and their arguments about this. I guess that the gap in value is surprisingly small. So in fact, in the classical late classical period, there is none on the Attic stele.
Because in late antiquity.
And there's some, but I mean, I think we're talking 15, 20%. And that makes me think, well, maybe, you wouldn't advertise for somebody that's 15% less, or there'd be some point where you're like, okay, this isn't worth advertising because it's a bit less. But I think that, I think I'll admit that this is part of what makes our evidence imperfect. But it certainly doesn't reverse my thinking.
Thank you so much for the talk. My question has to do with thinking about female slaves, and perhaps this is something that you've thought about in the larger project, but I was wondering how we might think about the likelihood of female slaves running away, especially in the Roman period when masters were often maybe often is a mischaracterization. We have evidence for masters marrying their female slaves, how that affects their sort of outlook on running away.
Okay, that's interesting. I thought you were going a different direction, and I think that I thought you were going in the direction of, rape and sexual harassment, which would generally go into this. What was one of my larger topics would be the experience of slavery, the push factors, which unfortunately is so complicated I came up with nothing decisive, right? It's like prostitute versus mind slave, something like that. Now, the ones that would marry, I think in most cases, you've got to assume that comes with manumission, always, and in fact is one of the grounds for going against the limits on manumission is for the purpose of marriage. So I think that that in general, that's a reason that slaves would run away less often. And there are people, and unfortunately, it would be nice if this was, if I was totally convinced. Orlando Patterson believes that enslaved women were always more likely to get manumission than men. I'm not quite actually positive about that, because that would be another thing that contributes. So I would like it if I really believed that was the case. And the manumission for the purpose of marriage, there is the fascinating thing there in terms of you can't run away after, you can't get divorced and leave. So there's that special rule that because obviously this is in the favor of Roman men of the slaveholding class, and they don't want someone to be very sweet to them until they get freedom, and then they're like, hey, we got great divorce laws, goodbye. So that the prevention of that is quite interesting.
I'll keep it here for 1 second. Thank you for your talk, that was great. In the beginning, you talked about different factors that you were considering, and I was wondering if I'm sure you have, because I know it's very condensed, but did you think about skill sets that male slaves would have as foreign military captives, and if that could play a part in this?
Yeah, let's see, you mean military skills?
Yeah. Travel, military skill, yeah, a variety of things.
Yeah, I think that there's the big picture you would think would be that the men are actually, it's a hierarchical, there's a patriarchy even within the slave system. So the most responsible jobs among enslaved people were dominated by men, and they have much more contact with the outside world. So that was something that I would like to argue was a factor. It turns out that there are all sorts of complexities and exceptions, which is why I didn't go into that. So there is, actually, it's just an ideal, even among the free. The seclusion of women is sort of a masculine ideology, and slaves are enslavers are famously able to go against sexual division of labor if they want to.
Okay, great.
I think we have to move on, but there'll be opportunity to ask more questions at the end. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So our second speaker is Gabriel Kruell, who is a full-time research associate in the Institute of Historical Research at the National Autonomous University of Mexico. Dr. Kruell studies Aztec codices and Aztec history by the historiography and philology of colonial era indigenous narratives, with a focus on the cultural and ethno-history of the Nahuas, a people of the Aztec Empire, who are today the largest indigenous group in Mexico. He is the co-author of Tiempos Superpuestos, overlapping times, an examination of the encounter between Nahua and European calendars. He's also the author of a new critical edition of the Chronica Tlacoyotl, Mexico City, 2021, a chronicle of the history of the Aztec Empire written in the Nahuatl language around the 16th century. In Mexico, his scholarly excellence has been recognized with several honors, including the Alfonso Caso Medal from the National Autonomous University of Mexico, and an honorable mention for Best Doctoral Dissertation. His talk this afternoon is entitled Tlacoyotl, Pre-Hispanic Slavery Among the Mexica. Please join me in welcoming Gabriel Kruell. So this is for the camera. Yeah. So you have two.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. It is truly an honor to be here at the Ohio State University and to share this space with such distinguished colleagues. I am grateful to Dr. Elizabeth Dillenberg and to Dr. Maria Esther Hamack for their kind invitation. I must say I feel especially at home on this panel. My Mexican wife, Cynthia, is also a Martinez-Cruz, so I feel surrounded by brilliant Martinez-Cruzes today. With your permission, I will now read my paper titled Tlacoyotl, Pre-Hispanic Slavery Among the Mexica. Before beginning, I would like to note that English is not my first language, so you may notice some difficulties in my reading and pronunciation. At the end of the presentation, I will answer questions in Spanish, and a kind interpreter, Dr. Hamack, will translate them for you. The institution of Tlacoyotl, or slavery among the Mexica and other Nahuatl-speaking peoples, present a complex and often misunderstood facet of Mesoamerican society. Unlike the racialized hereditary system imposed during the colonial and modern periods, Tlacoyotl was a socially and legally regulated status that could emerge from death, punishment, warfare, or even voluntary servitude in cases of poverty. It was not permanent nor necessarily transmissible across generations. As Camilla Townsend demonstrates in her essay, Slavery in Pre-Contact America, in the Cambridge World History of Slavery, the study of Tlacoyotl and pre-Hispanic slavery poses significant methodological challenges. The surviving sources, colonial codices, indigenous annals, and accounts by missionaries and Spanish officials are fragmentary, selective, and shaped by the biases of priorities and of colonial rule. Consequently, researchers must confront both the silences and the distortions within these materials, reading against the grain while remaining attentive to indigenous concepts and legal language. In this presentation, I explore the mechanism and meanings of slavery in Mexica society, drawing on visual and textual evidence. I examine how enslaved person, Tlacotin in Nahuatl, servos or esclavos in Spanish, servants or slaves in English, functioned not only as economic agents within tribute systems and marketplaces, but also as ritual subjects, integrated in cycles of symbolic renewal and sacrifice. Along the way, I will offer brief comparative gestures to deepen our understanding. As Peter Hunt has shown in his work on ancient Greece, enslaved individuals were integral to both war and society, yet their roles were often downplayed and or obscured in elite historiography. By contrast, in Mexica culture, the Tlacoyotl appear prominently in codices, annals, and ritual iconography, marked not only by their subjugated status, but also by cosmological significance. Furthermore, prisoners of war, mamaltin in Nahuatl, were socially distinguished from slaves acquired through the marketplace, Tlacoyotl, reflecting a clear differentiation between those captured in battle and those who entered servitude due to debt, criminal punishment, and other economic hardships. At the same time, as Paloma Martinez-Cruz has shown through her decolonial and performative readings of Mesoamerican epistemologies, bodies under constraint could still serve a site of symbolic agency. Enslaved individuals in Mexica society were not merely laboring bodies, but participants in sacred order, subjects of both discipline and meaning. During captivity, their bodies underwent profound ritual and symbolic transformations. They were dressed in the regalia of the gods to embody the deities themselves. After that, their flesh was consumed in ceremonial banquets, their skin were worn by priests, and their bones and hair were preserved as talismans, believed to grant power and protection to their captors and owners. The institution of Tlacoyotl, often translated as slavery in Mexica society, encompassed multiple forms and origins. Unlike the modern Atlantic system, it was neither racialized nor hereditary, with some exceptions, but rather a condition into which one could fall through diverse social and economic pathways. Understanding its form allows us to appreciate the complexity of Mexica traditions, religion, law, and economy. The first and perhaps most common pathway into servitude was debt. A free man who contracted a debt that he could not repay might enter into a relationship of dependency with his creditor. This debtor slavery, or Tlacoyotl for debt, did not erase his legal personality. He remained a member of his calpoli or local community, and his condition could, in principle, be reserved once the debt was satisfied. Still, during the period of obligation, he was bound to serve his master, sometimes even being sold to third parties if the debt persisted. A second form derived from punishment. The Mexica legal system imposed servitude on individuals who had committed certain crimes, such as theft or public disorder, when restitution was not otherwise possible. In such cases, enslavement functioned as a penal measure, but one that, again, was not necessarily lifelong. Relatives could negotiate their release, and in some circumstances, the enslaved person could redeem himself through labor or compensation. However, those deemed bad slaves, identified as incorrigible, could be sold up to 3 times, and in some instances were destined to sacrifice in ritual together with war prisoners. War captivity constituted yet another source. Here, it is important to distinguish between two categories: prisoners of war destined for sacrifice, called mamaltin, and slaves who were incorporated into the marketplace as tlacotin. The former were consecrated to the gods and almost invariably perished in ritual combat or sacrifice. The latter, however, could circulate as slaves in economic exchange, serving households, working in agriculture, or being resold in the markets. This category is closer to what we may consider a permanent form of servitude, although even here, the boundary was not absolute. Captives could sometimes be ransomed by their kind, or even eventually manumit themselves under specific conditions. Poverty also plays a significant role. A person unable to sustain himself or his family might voluntarily enter into slavery, offering his labor in exchange for sustenance. This voluntary form was paradoxical. It represented an act of agency, yet it also confirmed the structural inequalities of Mexica society. Once again, the voluntary slave did not forfeit all rights, and some provisions allowed for eventual release. Across these forms, mobility and rescue were always possible. An enslaved person could buy back his freedom, be redeemed by relatives, or even escape by reaching the royal palace or precinct of a temple where certain protections were in place. Nahua sources describe dramatic scenes in which a slave, pursued by his master, would run into the marketplace and seize the broom of the court officials, thereby invoking the protection of the law. Such gestures highlight that Tlacoyotl was deeply embedded in juridical and ritual practices, not simply a condition of brute force. The slavery in economic and ritual life. Enslaved individuals, Tlacotin, occupied a central place in the economic and religious structures of Mexica society. They were not only a source of labor in agriculture, domestic service, and artisanal production, but also functioned as a form of movable wealth, objects of exchange, tribute, and redistribution within imperial networks. Their presence in the bustling markets underscores their role as commodities, while their service in household and estates illustrates the extent to which their labor underpinned daily life and elite privilege. Beyond their economic importance, slaves were deeply integrated into the ritual fabric of the Mexica world. Many Tlacotin, along with their war captives, mamaltin, were destined for sacrifice, embodying the dual condition of being both instruments of production and vessels of sacred renewal. In the ritual calendar, enslaved person could be adorned as divine impersonators, temporarily embodying the gods they would eventually honor through their deaths. Their body thus traversed a symbolic cycle from service to sacrifice, from flesh to sacred matter, reinforcing the cosmological balance upon which Mexica political power was grounded. As Peter Hunt has observed for Greece, enslaved people often perform indispensable roles while remaining marginal or invisible in elite historiography. In the Mexica context, by contrast, The Tlacoyotl were not only legally codified, but also ritually and visually inscribed in codices and ceremonial life. Their visibility reflects both the pragmatic necessity of their labor and the symbolic weight of the deaths, which together wove them into the material and metaphysical fabric of the society. One festival was even dedicated to enslaved people, during which masters were forbidden to mistreat them. Any violation was believed to incur punishment from Tezcatlipoca, the deity who protected the slave. The duality of slave existence, simultaneously economic agents and ritual subjects, points to the structural integration of slavery into the Mexica society. Enslaved individuals were not relegated to the margins, but rather woven into the very mechanism of social reproduction. Their labor sustained households and markets, while their bodies sustained the sacred order through the sacrifice. This articulation between material production and symbolic regeneration suggests that Tlacoyotl was not an accidental feature of Mexica life, but a deliberate and codified institution, balancing social utility with religious benefits. Ritual death, far from negating the slave person role, crowned it with transcendental meaning. Once designated for sacrifice, the Tlacoyotl underwent a profound transformation. Their bodies were adorned with divine attributes, their movements choreographed into the liturgy of state festival. In these moments, the enslaved individual ceased to be simply a laboring body and became a medium for divine presence. Their immolation was believed to renew the cosmic cycle, ensuring agricultural fertility and political stability. Thus, the life of the slave did not terminate in obscurity, but in a highly visible, performative act that inscribed their existence within the sacred memory of the community. This centrality stands in stark contrast to other slave systems, such as Greek or the modern Atlantic, where enslaved persons were frequently silenced and rendered invisible. The Mexica world, by contrast, codices, annals, and ritual iconography consistently depicted the slave in both economic and sacred dimensions. Their presence in visual and textual media underscores a crucial point. Slavery and captivity in Mesoamerica were not merely endured but actively narrativized, ritualized, and memorialized as part of the social body. The Tlacoyotl were indispensable both as producers and as sacrificial offerings, embodying the fascination with otherness and enmity that separate their placing within Mexica society and the cosmos. The institution of Tlacoyotl cannot be fully understood without considering gender dynamics. Enslavement affected men and women differently, both in terms of labor, expectations, and ritual functions. While male slaves were frequently destined for heavy agricultural and military-related work, enslaved women were often absorbed into domestic service, textile production, or concubinage, in some cases into sexual labor as awianime, sacred courtesans whose role oscillated between coercion and limited autonomy. Their reproductive capacity, as well as their symbolic association with fertility, family care, and nurture, shaped the ways their bodies were valued and controlled. Thus, the enslaved female body was not only a site of economic utility, but also an intimate appropriation, where servitude and unfreedom intersected with gendered hierarchies of sexuality, reproduction, and ritual use. At the same time, the body itself, male or female, was treated as a canvas upon which meanings of power, relationship, and sacred renewal were inscribed. Slaves were subjected to form of bodily marking, whether through ritual costume, physical disciplines, or ceremonial display. As Paloma Martinez-Cruz has suggested, bodies marked by servitude could also become spaces of resignification, where constraint and domination coexisted with new symbolic possibilities. The transformation of the enslaved body into a ritualized image of the divine illustrates this paradox. In state festivals, enslaved individuals were clothed as gods, adorned with feather, paint, and jewelry, and trained to perform gestures of divine presence, dances, and ritual processions. Previously, their sacrifice, their subjugation, paradoxically, granted them temporary elevation to a sacred role. The ritual system of the Mexica relied heavily on this transformation. Enslaved men might be chosen to embody warrior deities and perish in combat like sacrifice, while enslaved women could impersonate goddesses associated with fertility, weaving, or the heart itself. In both cases, the sacrificial death was not a mere annihilation, but a regeneration. Their blood nourished the gods, their flesh and bones became sacred matter, and their deaths reinforced the cosmic cycle. The ritual performance thus recorded the enslaved body from a symbol of subjugation into a conduit of cosmic vitality. These transformations were not purely symbolic, they were enacted in a profoundly physical ways. Bodies were prepared, adorned, consumed, and dismembered in ceremonies that rendered visible the intimate entanglement of gender, servitude, and ritual practice. For instance, female captives could be sacrificed during ceremony dedicated to fertility, their body explicitly aligned with agricultural and human renewal. Male captives, by contrast, were often set into gladiatorial sacrifice, dramatizing ideals of martial valor and cosmic struggle. Such distinction reveal how gender structured not only the experience of enslavement, but also the ritual economy of the empire. Yet, it is important to note that within this system, enslaved individuals were not entirely stripped of agency. Performance offered fleeting spaces where the enslaved could embody divinity, reframe their suffering, or at least participate in a collective ritual that transcends their immediate condition. Martinez-Cruz notation of performance highlights how even within coercive structures, the body can become a medium of expression and symbolic negotiation. The enslaved individual, while disciplined and instrumentalized, was simultaneously inscribed into the sacred drama of the community, ensuring that their existence was neither silent nor invisible. Ultimately, the interplay of gender, body, and ritual underscores the complexity of Tlacoyotl in Mexica society. enslavement was not solely an economic and legal status, but a condition deeply embedded in symbolic structures that linked sexuality, reproduction, and cosmic renewal. Women and men alike were subjected to forms of bodily appropriation, but their ritual destiny diverged according to gender cosmologies. By transforming enslaved body into divine impersonators and sacrificial vessel, the Mexica both reinforced hierarchies and domination and reinscribed servitude with transcendental meaning. In this way, the institution of Tlacoyotl demonstrate how power was exercised, and not only through coercion, but also through ritualized embodiment, where that itself became a generative act. Conclusion. The study of Tlacoyotl invite us to reconsider what slavery means outside the Atlantic paradigm. Among the Mexica, enslavement was not racialized, not uniformly hereditary, but rather a legal and ritual condition that could emerge from debt, punishment, poverty, or war. Far from being invisible, the Tlacoyotl was codified in law, represented in codices, and inscribed in the ceremonial life of the empire. Their labor sustained the economy, and their ritual deaths renewed the cosmos, binding them simultaneously to the material and metaphysical life of the Mexica world. As Peter Hunt reminds us in the case of Greece, enslaved people often carry out indispensable role, yet remain absent from elite historiography. The Mexica case reveals a strikingly different dynamic. Here, the enslaved were not erased, but rendered visible as economic actors, symbolic figures, and even temporary embodiments of the divine. Following Paloma Martinez-Cruz, we can recognize how bodies marked by servitude also became site of transformation, where domination coexisted with ritual agency. By examining Tlacoyotl on its own cultural and juridical terms, we move toward a broader comparative understanding of slavery, one that recognizes the intersection of function, representation, and symbolism across societies. In doing so, we not only deepen our grasp of Mexica society, but also expand the very framework through which we study slavery as a human institution. Thank you all for your attention.
Okay, so we have some time for questions.
Thank you. When these enslaved individuals, when they had offsprings, did their kids follow the same path, same fate, or did they receive extra entitlements, or what happened to the offsprings?
¿Quieres que te la traduzca?
Sí, por favor, porque no escuché bien.
Cuando los esclavos tenían hijos, que si ellos seguían las mismas condiciones de los padres.
No, los hijos de esclavos no se volvían esclavos.
So the children of slaves did not become enslaved. And I think there was a second part to your question.
I think that answers.
That answers?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your words today, Dr. Kruell. My question is, you mentioned that the slaves are not invisible, the slaves are not silenced. At some points, the slaves have agency. So is there an opportunity for resisting the structure of enslavement, or are we looking at a system of especially visual representations that make it look as if the slaves are participating actively and visibly? Thank you.
La pregunta es que en tu plática mencionaste que los esclavos no estaban escondidos, estaban más visibles, entonces y mencionaste que tenían agency, o sea, agencia.
Sí.
Que se había, la pregunta de él es que si había oportunidades para que ellos resistieran o escaparan.
Claro, sí, efectivamente, como podemos ver en todas las imágenes que les presenté, los esclavos están muy representados en los códices, las fuentes, los documentos, se habla mucho de ellos.
So that I don't forget. Yes, so a lot of the enslaved people are very much represented in the codices, those are very visible. Continúa.
Ya. Y su papel en la sociedad era muy importante porque podían llegar a ser imágenes de los dioses.
Okay. And their roles in the society were so important because they could become representations of the gods in the society.
Y era muy importante en la sociedad, era codificado en la sociedad, de que no se podían maltratar los esclavos.
And it was also very important because in the society it was codified into law that they could not be mistreated.
Y si un dueño maltrataba a su propio esclavo, la deidad lo castigaba.
And if a slaveholder mistreated or violented an enslaved person, the deity, the gods, will punish that slaveholder.
Ya. Y había posibilidades también de huida, como vimos con el Dr. Hunt.
And there was also a lot of possibilities of escape, like Dr. Hunt mentioned.
Y como mencionaba en una plática con el Dr. Hunt, había un ritual particular.
Estaba mencionando con, sorry, he was talking to Dr. Hunt and there was like this ritual about escape.
Y un esclavo, si lograba escapar, podía llegar al mercado.
So the ritual was if an enslaved person managed to escape and if they managed to reach the marketplace.
Y buscaba o las autoridades o también existía la posibilidad de pisar un excremento para poder ser liberado.
Yeah. So the way that they could claim freedom is like they will run away to the market, and if they could find a place with excrement, you know, be it animal or whatever, and they could step on it, they could claim their freedom by stepping on that. I guess the society was very clean, you know, in that sense. So, okay, one more question. Thank you.
Could you just repeat what those the gendered ritual destinies were?
The gender ritual.
Yeah, I think there was something
gods?
about the gendered ritual destinies of men and women. I just
Oh, que si puedes repetir los rituales de género que habías.
Sí. Sí. Bueno, había tanto sacrificios de hombres como sacrificios de mujeres, okay. Pero los sacrificios de los hombres, en particular de los prisioneros de guerra, involucraban combates rituales.
Okay. Repeat that again, sorry.
Que los sacrificios de hombres mujeres, involucraban combates rituales en los que se moría al final.
So the sacrifices of women and men often entail combat in which one or the other died.
And women,
In particular, it was like
oh, with the men.
ritual
yeah.
that resulted in the captive's death.
Y las mujeres tenían diversas actividades, pero eran actividades femeninas y las llevaban al mercado o tenían que tejer, okay. Tenían que hacer danzas pero también eran sacrificadas al final.
Okay. So the women also had different roles. They were taken to the market. They would also have like dance rituals, but ultimately they would be sacrificed as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We can actually have one more time, one more question.
Okay, yes. Were women amongst the Tlacoyotl? ¿No? Hubo mujeres entre los Tlacoyotl
Ya.
que venden como, de plazo corto.
Sí.
Okay, yes. Okay, women were among the Tlacoyotl that sold themselves like temporarily, right? Kind of like pawning yourself.
Yeah.
And then buying about. Okay.
There was a category called awianime. In English will be like alegradoras, las que alegran a la gente.
The greeters? Or like
Hostess,
spreaders of cheerleaders, yeah. Spreaders of cheer.
It's not like, but it was like prostitute, but it was sacred, sacred prostitution, yeah.
I was about to translate that, but I was like, you said it in English.
Like consort,
Yeah,
ritual consort.
yeah.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Then, do you need the
I don't think I need
amplifier?
it.
This is for the video.
It's for the
recording,
video?
yeah.
Okay.
So I'll introduce you.
Okay. All right.
So one of the things I think is becoming clear is the connection among the talks is taking gender as a critical term of historical analysis. Our next speaker, moving to also on gender, is Dr. Paloma Martinez-Cruz, who is professor of Latina, Cultural and Literary Studies in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese, also in the Department of English here at Ohio State University. Her research surrounds food studies, performance studies, Chicanx, Latinx, counterculture, and community arts. An interdisciplinary scholar-artist, Dr. Martinez-Cruz is the author most recently of Trust the Circle, The Resistance and Resilience of Ruben Castilla Herrera, 2023, a biography of this Columbus, Ohio-based grassroots organizer at the forefront of many regional social justice campaigns for the lives of migrants, refugees, farm workers, and the dispossessed. Her second book, Food Fight, Millennial Mestizaje Meets the Culinary Marketplace, University of Arizona Press, 2019, tackles head-on the real-world politics of food production, from the exploitation of farm workers to the appropriation of Latinx bodies and culture. She's also published Women in Knowledge in Mesoamerica, from East LA to Anahuac, University of Arizona Press, 2011, which examines the intellectual traditions of Mesoamerican women. She is additionally the co-editor of a handbook for the rebel artist in a post-democratic society, 2019, which provides a guide for creative activism and performance art in an era of political and social upheaval. Her current performance work includes the Columbus Taco Reparations Brigade, an intervention to raise awareness around the enduring colonial structures and their resistance in our foodways. Her contribution to our panel this afternoon is entitled Women Healers of Tenochtitlan, Mexica, Rites, and Female Warriors. Please join me in welcoming Professor Paloma Martinez-Cruz.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. So thank you so much for working through these languages. You know, we throw a lot at some, you know, I realize whenever somebody, English dominant reads an intro, I realize, oh, I'm throwing a lot out there. I don't think of it so much. And thank you, Gabriel, for the gesture of dialogue and community that you brought. And thank you, Peter, for your grounding research that it just gives gave me a lot to think about. So I look forward to continuing the conversation across the three of our presentations today and with all of you, and to hear a little bit, I hope, learn a little bit more about what brings you here today, what your interests are, what you're pursuing, especially graduate students. So this work started as a graduate student. I took a class with Professor Diana Taylor, NYU, and it was the first year of the Hemispheric Institute of Performance and Politics. And I was in a Spanish and Portuguese department where one didn't do this stuff, right? And I know that because I had a professor say, we don't do that. That's not what we do here. I needed to kind of find a way to historicize. This was a work in women of color, Chicana feminist epistemology, right? Which meant I had to look at non-lettered culture production. And how do I do that? And I felt this urgency to historicize. I'm not a historian, but I felt an urgency to come up with a historical perspective, to figure out where does this history come from? Understand that I was in a moment at UC Berkeley, and then I went to Columbia University where I was doing this research when we were getting a lot of messages. They made affirmative action illegal at the time that I was at UC Berkeley, and people were very frank about, Latinos stealing a place in the university that really didn't belong to them because maybe on whole test score averages were not what they thought was deserving of a Berkeley education. And I would look at the philosophy classes, I would look at the literature classes, and really it's like, okay, there's the Plato and the Socrates, or there's the, Emerson and Thoreau, but when someone tells you you don't belong to tradition of thinkers, you don't have an intellectual legacy, I set out to use my research to understand what epistemic authority looked like from a historical perspective and then through modern times. So my different chapters of Women in Knowledge were very much starting in the post-classic Tenochtitlan and then going into contemporary times. The chapter that I'm looking at today is the second chapter in the book, which deals with Aztec midwives, right? That's where I located intellectual authority, spiritual authority in the Mesoamerican world, was through the traditions of parteras, curanderas, chamanas, like healers, midwives, sometimes mystics. So that was the history, that was the legacy, the inherited tradition that I wanted to look like, that I wanted to look at. What I wanted to look like was a different thing. I wanted to have my Plato and my Socrates, right? But I had to decolonize my own ideas of epistemology, right? Of how knowledge is transmitted. So what I discovered what I leaned into was that the Western intellectual authority, Western philosophical pursuits looked centripetal, right? I publish a paper, therefore I am, no? And for midwives and healers, it was centrifugal. It was the transmission of healing that was how somebody earned intellectual and spiritual authority in their context, right? It was a transmission of healing. It was a centrifugal rather than a self-aggrandizing performance, right? It was a transmission. So in graduate school is where I started to look at pre-conquest Mexica culture. And when Dr. Maria Hammock invited me to share my research at this symposium, I was excited to connect my Tenochtitlan research to the problem of slavery, to call attention to ways that feminine fertility catalyzed male participation in military victory, particularly in the taking of enemy captives. The particular slave class mentioned by Gabriel, it's a particular slave class in the post-classic Mexica world. The elevation of the warrior paradigm was one among many aspects of Mexica society that compelled scholars to acknowledge that theirs was stratified according to patriarchal principles. Men expected women to be chaste, modest, submissive, and monogamous, while men could have any number of lovers. Female adultery was punished harshly, while a married man could respectably be promiscuous as long as the women he touched were unmarried, i.e. not someone else's property. Women were handed out as spoils among nobles and warriors. They played no visible role in the governing of the state. Indeed, the title "He Who Speaks," the Tlatoani, the highest leader, it was conferred on the highest ruler while women were entirely barred from the world of public address. Hey, we did it. Okay. Medicine women among the Mexica offered a qualified exception. They publicly pursued medical knowledge, held offices of liturgical and spiritual authority, and championed women's ways of knowing in the arena of civic ritual. The respect and deference publicly conferred upon midwives in Tenochtitlan tell the story of a cultural system that revered female fertility, even within the Mexica symbolic universe that prioritized warfare and warriorhood. Warfare was central to Aztec culture, shaping both male and female identities. Men were defined by their battlefield success, while women's childbirth was symbolically linked to combat. Ahead of childbirth, the family hiring a midwife publicly beseeched her to help the parturient mother win a captive. That was the language that was used, win a captive for the household, while education for boys focused on military training to produce skilled warriors. Though social rank was mostly inherited, warfare offered a rare path to upward mobility. Capturing enemies in battle could elevate a warrior's status and secure prestige for future generations. In this highly stratified society, several types of slaves and captives occupied the most disempowered social positions. Below the commoners in rank were the Mayeke, landless serfs, I believe that's how I'm saying it, and the institution that we already saw in the institution of Tlacoyotl and the Tlacotin that Professor Kruell has described, and which is not, let me see, with an emphasis that is not permanent or not hereditary in these cases that we just looked at. In post-classic Mexica society, a war captive was another type of enslaved person. In Nahuatl, a Mali, plural mamaltin, acquired through warfare, held immense social, economic, and religious importance. Enslavement was especially harsh, or could be especially harsh for mamaltin captured in battle, as they faced the possibility of being sold after their capture or chosen for ritual sacrifice during religious events or festivals. For instance, certain slaves were designated as Ixiptla, and their flayed skin was worn by a priest as symbolic embodiment of a designated deity. So it's a compliment to be like, you're a god, but then the priest comes with the obsidian knife and takes your whole skin off, and then that's put onto, ritually becomes the garb of a priest who's like, yeah, that I'm a god, you know, so it's like a mixed compliment. What do menstrual rites have to do with it? I'm glad you asked. Even though this is older, like this is back in the day research for me, right? I've been in it for a minute. I defended my dissertation, I filed my dissertation in 2004, right? So, and I published this in 2011. It took me years to feel confident to even know where to start asking questions about the Mexica universe, the post-classic Mexica world. But I do teach this chapter routinely. I teach this chapter in my gender and like my women, let me see, how do I call it? Gender and Power in the Americas class. And this is the first chapter that I like to teach because it gets us thinking, looking at post-classic Mexica rites gets us thinking about how we understand, even in our society today, women's bodily boundaries. Are they perceived as inherently pure or as inherently polluting, right? And looking at this time and this place lets us defamiliarize ourselves with our own understanding of why is breast milk taboo? Where's our parade when we're at the onset of puberty? Or is it something that is cloaked in shame, right? Well, what did the Mexica do? So returning to the status of women and the reverence for female fertility in a society in which the warrior paradigm was exalted, the performativity of menstruation was central to reminding young men of their civic duty to capture victims for blood sacrifice, and was used to urge them to bring home a Mali captive from the field of battle, right? Female menstruation was weaponized, was an agent, was a technology of war. The story of Mexica attitudes towards menses is not an easy one to piece together. Sahagún makes no mention of the menstrual cycle. López Austin, arguably the most accomplished investigator and prolific writer on the Mexica conception of the human body, writes, quote, menstruation in its multiple terms does not appear etymologically to be thought of as an impurity. The words allude to it simply as a hemorrhage, as a periodic emission, or as an infirmity, end quote. In the book Aztecs and Interpretation, Inga Clendenin writes, no special note, I'm quoting, no special note seems to have been taken of the onset of menstruation. That is, no shame appears to have been attached to the simple condition of being female. Apparently, the Mexica women did not undergo stretches of quarantine, ritualistic post-menstrual purifications, or strict prohibitions. Although my interpretation is culled from the dubious material left by Spanish chroniclers, there is one thing we can say with certainty. The paucity of ethnohistories involving menstrual rites simply does not jibe with what we know about blood in the Mexica Empire. If ever a city's works were lubricated by blood, it was that of classic Tenochtitlan, where the red splash of life was more than just ceremonially significant, it was ubiquitous. I have this image here of Apache and Tanzanian menstrual rites to just put us in the imagery, or put us into the symbolic universe of what different cultures do and how cultural anthropologists point to that onset of puberty for women to understand how, as I said, bodily boundaries are viewed, and how women as pollutants or women as powerful are inscribed in society. So back to the blood. The Spanish called the 18 major annual ceremonies veintenas, as these spanned the length of 20 days. That's also in Starbucks why it's called a venti. Yeah. The veintenas were thought to appease the divine forces that ensured Mexica survival. In the war season, which lasted for 9 months of the 18-month solar calendar, warriors and priests spilled blood to appease Huitzilopochtli's insatiable thirst on the battlefield. Blood and human hearts fed the sun and earth gods, and it was the unique charge of the Mexica to meet their target hemoglobin quotas at home and abroad. In Book 2 of the Florentine Codex, examples of the ritual centrality of blood abound. Human hearts were routinely and publicly torn from the chest cavities of slaves, war captives, and prisoners. But blood did not enter into public contemplation only when the priests drew their requisite quantities from the tops of the pyramids. Offering blood was also an individual matter, albeit one that, like the pyramidal displays, fell under the definition of civic duty. Every member of the populace, men, women, and children alike, babies, everyone, was obliged to make regular offerings of blood from their earlobes, tongues, and thighs or shins from the time of early infancy. Menarche, or the first menstrual period in a female adolescent, presented an occasion for a public display of authority through the acknowledgement that young women had won blood for the city of Tenochtitlan. Let's do it. During the Tosostli Veintena, Tenochtitlan honored Chicomecoatl. the goddess of the harvest, in a pageant of new womanhood. Duran describes the wooden representation of the goddess during the season consecrated to her. And this is what Duran says. Quote, "The figure was ornately carved in the form of a young maiden around 12 years of age. The girl was clothed entirely in red, and her cheeks were rouged. She wore a necklace of golden ears of corn tied with a blue ribbon." End quote. 12-year-old, entirely in red, cheeks rouged. So the age, colors, and agricultural references to the harvest yield combine to describe the image of a woman, a young woman, newly of age. Book 2 of the Florentine Codex narrates the procession of young women that, here we have a sculpture image of Chicomecoatl. Book 2 of the Florentine Codex narrates the procession of young women that carried offerings to the temple of Chicomecoatl. Okay, so Book 2 of the Florentine Codex, procession of women. Feminine fertility is ennobled during this ceremony, when the colors and adornments all call attention to a woman's budding maturity. They carried maize cobs wrapped in paper, reddened with liquid rubber, and their cheeks were rouged with iron pyrite. On the occasions of weddings or during the ritual feast held in honor of Tezcatlipoca, the maidens were called to dance, thus adorned, to attract the attention of potential suitors. So here the female actors are described as young girls, but they are also adorned in a way that symbolizes that they are ready to be married, indicating that they had only recently crossed the threshold into that time of marriageability. The warrior youths of the city were relegated to a supporting role on this occasion. They accompanied the young women on their trek to Chicomecoatl's temple as escorts, but were forbidden to speak with them or distract them from their duty. Okay? Here you have young boys around 12 years old, young girls around 12 years old. Boys, do not talk to the girls. What's going to happen, right? They accompanied the young woman, and the codices tell us that the Mexica teens were not so different from the ones we know today. They would not pass up the opportunity to show off, to misbehave, to flirt. They did. And I'm going to quote from the Florentine Codex, and it's in Old English, which is, you know, perfect. They finally translated the codices into Old English. You know? But I love it. I love it because it does give us that distancing, right? It is this veil of like remoteness that I feel like we need to be able to kind of enter into the imagination. I'm quoting, "And if someone joked with one of them," now if one of the boys joked with one of the girls, "and if someone joked with one of them, they chid him. One said to him, 'He with the occipital tuft of hair can speak? Canst thou talk? Be thou already concerned over how thy tuft of hair will fall off, thou with the little tuft of hair. It is an evil-smelling tuft of hair. It is a stinking tuft of hair. Art thou not just a woman like me? Nowhere hath thy excrement been burnt.'" Some turned on her. They said, "It is well. I am just going. I know. It is not true. It is not like that. Thou hast conferred a favor. So also wilt thou be. Anoint thy stomach with mud. Scratch thy stomach. Twist one leg around the other. Fall, striking thyself on the ground. Fall stinking on the ground. There is a stone, a hard stone. Strike thy face with it. Make the blood spurt forth. Scratch thy nose with the stone, or bore a hole with a fire drill into thy windpipe. Thou wilt spit through there. Just go away. Just be an old maid." But although the words of us men were like this, they were verily only in vain. They were verily only weak words. For verily thus the women could torment young men into war. Thus they moved them. Thus the woman could prod them into battle. Indeed, we men said, "Bloody painful are the words of the women. bloody penetrating are women's words. Indeed, we have gone. We have said that we shall not live. Perhaps we shall merit something, O friend, O our friend. So, end quote from Florentine Codex. In this passage, the young girls participated in a citywide spectacle of obeisance to Tlacoyotl, as was the privilege and obligation of all newly pubescent young women of Tenochtitlan. It was their first blood that permitted them to participate in the presentation of maize cobs before Tlacoyotl, where they made a mockery of their young male escorts, right? They slaughtered them. They obliterated them. The youth's hair, as you noted, was a target, a particular target of derision. Young men shaved their heads. In the Mexica post-classic world, they shaved their heads until 10. And that's when they graduated to the next stage, which is you shave your head but just have this little lock in the back, like a little baby ponytail, a stinking tuft, right? Now, this lock was permitted to cut. They were permitted to cut it only after they had taken their first captive, a powerful incentive for the adolescent who comes of age under the gaze of a community in which his warriorhood and thereby his manhood is worn as an external pendant for all the city to see. With the exception of those who were too old, too sick, virtually all the men were required to put aside their other jobs and commitments to take up the task of soldiering whenever they were called. Since a man's hair conveyed his warrior status, the teasing jousts of women so thoroughly demeaned them that no entreaty for the women to, quote, go off and be old maids had any chance of restoring their maligned dignity. Likewise, the young woman's intriguing taunt of, nowhere hath thy excrement been burned. It referred to the warrior's custom of burning feces on the battlefield. So we're both teaming up to surprise you with fecal matter today. Burning feces on the battlefield, and again called into question their escort's manhood. This passage makes it resoundingly clear that the young men did not quite measure up. They were not yet like their female counterparts. They had not yet captured blood for the Mexica Empire. They had not brought captives back to Tenochtitlan. Art thou not just a woman like me? The maiden was referring to the lock of hair that still hung in place. Next, his feeble rejoinder sent her to strike herself and make herself bleed from the impact. There is a stone, a hard stone, strike thy face with it, make the blood spurt forth, scratch thy nose with the stone, or bore a hole with a fire drill into thy windpipe that will spit through there. He lamely concluded his retort by saying, just be an old maid, right? With his thin retort, we can discern that the young woman had already given blood, won blood for their country, and that his insults were an attempt to lessen her achievement. Your blood can squirt out in any old way. You're not so special, yeah. But she was special, and she knew it. She was the victorious, blood-winning daughter of the Mexica world that esteemed the red nourishment as the highest possible tribute to the gods. Right? The way he's telling her, oh, just bore a hole. You can bleed from any old place. You're not that special. But she was. To conclude, if menstrual laws that restrict women's participation in her community's activities are characteristic of a social order that interprets menstruation as evidence of unclean bodily barriers, Mexica fertility rites tell a story in which the young men who have not taken maltin are of a lower social rank than young women who have begun to menstruate. I can think of no greater power in a young Mexica man's life than the possibility of facing a young, marriageable girl's scorn in the public square. How do you get a young 12-year-old boy to go into battlefield and risk his life to bring back a captive? And it's the thought of repeating the spectacle of being a young escort again in this procession of Chicomecoatl, right? Oh, weren't you here last year? Oh, what is this, year 4 for you? They say it in the Florentine Codex. Better for us to go off and die. Verily, the words of women sent these young boys to, they'd rather die in the battlefield than continually appear with this pageant of being subordinate to young women who had captured blood for the Mexica Empire. That's it. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for listening.
So we have time for questions.
Thank you very much. That was really interesting. And it is nice to occasionally hear that there are societies out there who maybe could say something positive about women. I wanted to know a little bit more about the Florentine Codex. I mean, Florentine makes me feel like this is something that is very much done up by Europeans. So do you get a sense of like some sort of European interpretation of customs, or is this definitely written by somebody who understands what's going on?
Yes. So I think the Florentine Codex, just like any of the chronicles from that moment of contact and conquest, must be viewed critically. We cannot, there's no way to just wholesale, accept what's happening in the Codex, which is why, like, I definitely read different sources, like the Duran's Chronicles. And Sahagún, it was very interesting because he was a friar, like he was a clergy, Catholic clergy, and he conducted interviews in Nahuatl with Nahuatl correspondence. So he was doing an ethnography that is hailed as one of the most reliable. It was in their language, but of course, we're talking about like priests from Spain, like Iberian priests talking to locals who were going to be already subordinate and already, very, very compromised in terms of what they shared, what they concealed, what they thought what they thought that the priest interviewing them wanted to hear, because their material life chances, their material chances were going to perhaps rely on that relationship and telling their interviewers, right, like what they wanted to hear. So of course, this is an interpretation. But this particular ritual, there's references to it across many different texts and across different images. So but yes. Thanks. Yes to the questioning Sahagún, yes to being critical of the Florentine Codex. Yeah.
Question?
Thank you, Paloma. That was such a fascinating talk. I learned so much.
Thank you.
I've got maybe 2 questions. One is, could you say a little bit more about who Chicomecoatl is? And the other is, in terms of these 12-year-old girls and the clout that they have, is part of that because the blood of menstruation is spontaneous? That, sure, I can go jab a sharp stick in my windpipe and I'll bleed, but look, my body is doing it spontaneously, as if perhaps, mystically, magically divine. And even to overcome an enemy in battle requires a great deal of effort. And so is there something about the ease, the spontaneous generation of blood that makes it particularly powerful?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yes. Chicomecoatl, thank you. Chicomecoatl was 7 serpent skirt, right? I think her name refers to like 7 serpents. She was the goddess. This particular festival took place in the springtime. And she was the goddess, like there were different agricultural goddesses, but she was very much depicted as like the young maize cob, like the lady of the young maize cobs. You also see in images of her, when they're like the sculptural images, you'll see that she has very like nascent budding breasts. It is definitely like a puberty moment that we're looking at, rather than a grandmother goddess, which there are grandmother earth goddesses too that are depicted, but she's very much the avocation that is like the newly pubescent young maize cob image. And then for the blood, I have a section of this chapter is called A Case for Mexica Vulva Envy. So picking up on Freud and penis envy, from the earliest infancy, young boys are required to give blood in way, like the perforations happen to give symbolic bleeding, right? There's even like festivals called the lesser perforation, the greater perforation, where people are giving like ritual blood. Boys have to give blood from the penis, and girls don't have to give blood from the vagina from early infancy. So we're seeing, and the warriors, there's this, like when they have a captive, they talk about it as like father-son. So there is very much, it feels like the warrior class is symbolically catching up to the intrinsic, the intrinsic sacredness, the intrinsic creatrix, divine, divinity of the female body that they have to become warriors and then kind of catch up with. Once they become warriors, they're more important than the girls. But it's so clever to use young male humiliation by young menstruating girls to like make them agents of like, you could do as many calisthenics, you could have drill sergeants, put a young girl, get a young girl to tell a boy he sucks, in a parade in front of everyone, and then he can only cut his hair, to get out of doing that parade in which he's told by young girls that he sucks, like I can't imagine a more I can't imagine like a more effective war machine, right? Like more effective war propaganda. I put it to you and I leave it with you.
Other questions?
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. And thank you. I appreciate both of you so much. I've learned such an amazing amount. I had one possible observation about the timing of menarche, and it's because from social history I recall that they first get records of menarche in some, like Sweden or someplace, and it turns out that it starts at 16. And the time has been going down and down and down. So I wonder if it might be possible to actually envision these as 15-year-old boys and 15-year-old girls, in which case maybe the connection with going to battle next year might be a bit closer.
We know that the boys graduate into that moment of having the occipital tuft at the age of 10, right? We don't have an age range for these young girls, but what my interpretation is, right, is that whenever a young girl entered puberty, right, had her first period, that would be what made her eligible for this, and that it was a specific, like, girls, they're adorned as girls of marriageable age. So I'm not saying that it's a 9-year-old or a 12-year-old or a 13-year-old. I'm like, when this happens, that's what makes her a maiden of Chicomecoatl and allows her to put on the garb that signals that she's of marriageable age. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, but the age is not specified. Okay. Yeah.
And I'm just suggesting it might be.
Yeah.
You kept saying 12, and it might be actually 15.
I like that. Yes, I didn't mean to overemphasize or try to really pinpoint a year. So yes, thank you for that.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Are there any further questions? Yes. It's being recorded.
Oh, that's true. Right. Okay. You mentioned oh my God, here it is. Those perforation rituals, like the lesser and the greater, right? When did those happen, and like how often? Or?
When we think of 20, how do you know when
I'm not sure.
the vigil of the greater and lesser? Do you happen to know? I'm trying to call a friend.
No, I'm not sure.
Yeah. There was a veintena for each of those a year, so it was an annual thing, but I don't remember what season it corresponds to or the name of the month. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not recalling.
Oh, sorry. Oh, I guess I should. And then, did the fact that these young women were already giving blood, did that, like through menstruation, did that affect like how often they had to participate in the ritual, or was it just like everyone's in on this thing like at the same time?
It's not specified.
Okay.
My interpretation, looking at performance studies and looking at the ritual that's available to us as described in the Florentine Codex and in the Duran writings, what I hypothesize is that puberty allows these girls to participate for the first time. I don't know the duration of it, but I do hypothesize that puberty is what gets you in that door, because they are dressed like the way Duran describes as girls of marriageable age, that are at times referred to as girls and at times as women, and are adorned like people of marriageable age.
And the final question.
But I would love the answers to this. I would love these answers. I'm fascinated by the mysteries of this ritual.
Thank you so much for both of you, the last two speakers. And I was wondering, and Paloma, it's nice to see you again. I'm trying to figure out, I'm in my brain that knows virtually nothing about like pre-Columbian Mesoamerica, even early Columbian Mesoamerica. Like, how do we bring you guys together? Like, what about the slave's body marks it? You were making very clear the female body at menstruation signals your sort of position in this position of power that is in many ways, subversive, in the sense that usually young girls have no power. And so here we are kind of, turning it upside down and putting these girls in this position of power. We put the slave in a similar situation, but what marks the slave or the captive as ripe, as it were, for sacrifice? What makes one slave picked to be sacrificed over another slave? Is there something about their body? Is there something, is there a marker?
Yeah.
What is that?
Sí, cómo eligen a un cautivo, ¿no? Para elegirlo para el sacrificio.
I couldn't hear. I'm
Sí.
sorry.
I was just saying it in Spanish. Yeah.
Oh, gracias.
Yeah.
Maybe can I answer in Spanish?
Maria will.
Yeah, if Maria translate for me.
Or the expert Paloma.
No. Entre las dos, between the two of us.
Oh, Paloma.
Yeah, sure. Between the two of us.
Okay, thank you. Hay una fiesta muy importante. De hecho, en las fuentes la mencionan como si fuera la Pascua de los antiguos mexicanos, que es Tenochtitlan.
There's a festival that is similar to we might think of it as a Mexica Easter. It's called Tenochtitlan.
Y en esta fiesta se tenía que escoger el guerrero, el prisionero de guerra más bello y perfecto. Su cuerpo no tenía que tener ninguna mancha, su piel, su cabello, sus ojos, todo tenía que ser perfecto.
At the festival, somebody, a warrior was selected. He couldn't have scar. He had to be the most beautiful, the most perfect, as free as possible of any scars or blemishes.
Y este era la imagen de Tezcatlipoca, el dios máximo de los mexicas.
And this was going to be the representative image, was going to embody Tezcatlipoca, the highest of the gods in the pantheon.
Y era el representante del dios y del gobernante, y cuando él aparecía todo el mundo tenía que adorarlo y comer tierra. Había un ritual de comer tierra. Cuando se estaba enfrente de una deidad o de un gobernante se tenía que comer tierra.
Okay, and he represented the highest authority, and people would have to bow to him, and when he passed by, they would have to eat, like ritualistically eat the earth that he, the ground he stood on.
Y bueno, personalmente yo creo que eso nos habla de una cosmología distinta de la nuestra, en la que, y eso lo puedo ver en muchos pueblos americanos, en el que el enemigo, el otro, el esclavo, puede de repente llegar a ser la deidad o el gobernante.
Okay, so this is pointing to a cosmovision that is very different than the one that we have. And then the second part of it, Maria, did you get that? The gobernante?
Different cosmology from what we're used to, in which the other or the enemy or the slave could become so powerful as to be a deity or the the maximum governor.
Okay, I think that brings our session to a close. I want to ask you all if you could thank our panelists once more.